Before we begin, please be advised that this story delves into themes of psychological distress, unexplained phenomena, and intense situations. Listener discretion is advised for this presentation. Imagine digging through the forgotten corners of history, not in some grand hallowed archive, but in the dusty, cramped basement of a university library. Not for some noble, groundbreaking discovery, but because you're a grad student, David Miller, and it's summer, and this is the only job you could find that pays enough to cover rent and ramen. It's the kind of place where sunlight has never dared to penetrate, where the air hangs heavy with the scent of decaying paper and forgotten ambition. You're supposed to be cataloging boxes of defunct departmental records, a task so mind-numbingly dull it makes you question every life choice that led you to a PhD in history. Most days it was exactly that, dull. Endless boxes of financial statements from the 70s, disciplinary reports on students long graduated, faculty meeting minutes outlining squabbles over stapler budgets. But then there are moments when the sheer tedium breaks, and you stumble upon something that doesn't quite fit. Something that makes the hairs on your arms stand up, even in the stale, airless quiet. That moment for David came on a Tuesday, late afternoon, when the fluorescent lights above flickered with their usual dying groan. He was wrestling with a particularly stubborn stack of boxes labeled Miscellaneous, Do Not Disturb, tucked away behind an industrial shelving unit that seemed to have been cemented into the concrete floor. The labels were handwritten in a precise, almost clinical script, unlike the usual chaotic scrawl of the department secretary. As he shifted the boxes, the last one, smaller and heavier than the rest, slid free. It wasn't a standard archive box. It was a sturdy wooden crate, latched shut with rusted metal clasps. And on its lid, etched deeply into the wood, were 3 words: Project Chimera Restricted. Project Chimera. The name alone was enough to send a shiver down David's spine. It sounded less like academic research and more like something out of a pulp fiction novel. Curiosity, a dangerous trait for an archivist whose job was to preserve, not to investigate, took hold. He found a crowbar, carefully pried open the latches, and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled among layers of yellowing foam, were not documents, but a collection of old audio cassettes, neatly organized and labeled, each in its own plastic case. And beneath them, a single leather-bound journal. The journal was thick, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting. David carefully turned to the first page. It was a title page, stark and formal. Project Chimera, Case Files and Session Transcripts, Dr. Eleanor Vance. Below that, a date range, October 1993 to March 1994. Dr. Eleanor Vance. The name rang a faint bell. She was a renowned psychologist, a pioneer in cognitive behavioral therapy, who had worked at the university decades ago. Her work was celebrated, public. So why was this hidden? Why restricted? David's gaze fell back to the cassettes. There were dozens of them, each one labeled with a subject number and a session number. Subject 01 Session 1, Subject 01 Session 2, and so on, progressing through Subject 02, Subject 03, until he reached a series that stood out. These were labeled Subject 04, and there were more of them than any other subject. Subject 04 Session 1, Subject 04 Session 2, all the way up to Subject 04 Session 37. 37 sessions. That was an extraordinary number for any kind of psychological study, especially one seemingly compressed into a 5-month period. Most research subjects participated in a handful of sessions, a dozen at most. 37 hinted at something far more intensive, far more prolonged. He picked up the journal again, flipping through it until he found the section dedicated to Subject 04. The entries began innocently enough, dated November 3, 1993. Subject 04, Emily Davis. Female, 22 years old. Presenting with severe anxiety, recurring nightmares, and dissociative episodes following a traumatic event. Initial assessment indicates profound psychological distress, but no immediate signs of psychosis. Commencing standard CBT protocol. David read on, a knot forming in his stomach. The tone of the entries shifted quickly. Dr. Vance's clinical detachment began to fray. November 10th. Emily reports auditory hallucinations. Claims to hear whispers, often her own name, when alone. Dismissed as stress-induced, but her conviction is unusually strong. November 17th. Sessions are becoming difficult. Emily is increasingly agitated, prone to sudden outbursts. Her hallucinations are evolving. She now describes full conversations with an unseen presence, claims it calls itself the Watcher. Standard therapeutic approaches are proving ineffective. December 1st, unforeseen manifestations. During session, Emily exhibited an unusual physical reaction, a sudden violent tremor, followed by a momentary loss of consciousness. When she awoke, her voice was different, deeper, and she spoke in a language I did not recognize. This lasted less than a minute, logged as a severe dissociative episode, but I am concerned. David's breath hitched. A different voice? An unknown language? This was far beyond standard anxiety or trauma. This was venturing into territory that felt less like psychology and more like something else entirely. He continued to scan the pages, each entry deepening the sense of unease. December 15th. Emily's personality is fragmenting. She refers to herself in the third person, claims the Watcher is growing stronger, demanding more, reports experiencing physical pain, unexplained bruises appearing on her body. My team is baffled. We've ruled out self-harm. December 28th. The occurrences are escalating. Objects in the therapy room have been displaced. The temperature drops inexplicably. Emily's eyes, they sometimes seem to change color, or rather the light in them changes. It's unsettling. I've initiated a consultation with Dr. Peterson from the parapsychology department, despite my skepticism. Parapsychology? That was the final clue David needed. Dr. Vance, a respected psychologist, was seeking help from a parapsychologist. This wasn't a standard case study. This was something extraordinary, something she was clearly struggling to comprehend. He looked at the stack of cassettes again, his gaze lingering on Subject 04 Session 1. He had to hear it. He just had to. He rummaged through a nearby box of discarded electronics and, to his surprise, found an ancient, portable cassette player, complete with an equally ancient pair of headphones. It looked like it hadn't been used since the 80s, but after some fiddling with the battery compartment, it sputtered to life. With trembling hands, David took Subject 04 Session 1 from its case and slotted it into the player. He pressed play, the whirring of the tape mechanism sounding unnaturally loud in the silent basement. He put on the headphones. First the hiss of analog tape, then a woman's clear professional voice. Dr. Vance. Good morning, Emily. How are you feeling today? A pause. Then a younger, softer voice, hesitant. I don't know, Dr. Vance. The dreams, they're getting worse. He's always there, watching. David leaned closer, straining to hear. Emily's voice was fragile, laced with fear. He could feel the tension in the recording, even from decades ago. Dr. Vance's voice, calm and reassuring. Can you tell me more about him, Emily? The figure you described. Another pause, longer this time. Then a faint scratching sound, almost imperceptible, like nails dragging across a surface, or perhaps something else entirely. David frowned, adjusting the headphones. Was it just tape degradation? Emily's voice returned, but it was different. Not just fearful, but imbued with a strange, almost guttural quality, as if she was struggling to speak. He says I belong to him now. He says you can't help me. And then it happened. A sudden sharp crackle that wasn't static. It sounded like something breaking in the room. And beneath it, a low resonant groan. It wasn't Emily's voice. It wasn't Dr. Vance's. It was something else. Something ancient and deeply, profoundly wrong. David ripped the headphones off, his heart hammering against his ribs. The basement, usually just boring, now felt suffocating. The air, once stale, now felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence. He looked at the tape player, then at the wooden crate, then at the journal, its pages filled with Dr. Vance's increasingly desperate words. This wasn't a forgotten research project. This was a warning, a record of something that should have remained buried. And he, David Miller, the history grad student, had just unearthed it. He had opened the door to Subject 04. And now he had to decide if he dared to listen to what came next. He had to listen. The thought was a cold, stark realization, cutting through the initial fear like a razor. David Miller, the history grad student, had stumbled onto something far grander, far more terrifying than a forgotten academic curiosity. This wasn't merely a record of a failed experiment. It was a testament, a final desperate plea from the brink of an abyss. The old man's words, his trembling voice, had been a key, turning in a lock David hadn't even known existed. and now the door was ajar. His fingers, still slightly numb from the chill of the basement, fumbled with the ancient reel-to-reel player. The hum of the machine as he powered it on was a nervous counterpoint to the thumping of his own heart. He carefully threaded the first large reel labeled Subject 0 for Initial Assessment, tape 1 of 9 onto the spindle, the magnetic tape a thin dark ribbon promising untold secrets. He pressed play, the clatter of the mechanism echoing in the quiet of his small apartment, a hiss of static, then the distinct click of a microphone being activated. Recording initiated. Date: October 14, 1998. Subject: Emily Carter. Age 22. Attending personnel: Dr. Alan Finch, lead psychiatrist. Sarah Jenkins, registered nurse. The voice was calm, professional, almost clinical. Dr. Alan Finch. David imagined a man in a crisp white coat, meticulously writing notes on a clipboard, his expression unreadable. "Good morning, Emily. How are you feeling today?" Finch's voice was smooth, reassuring. A pause. Then a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. "Tired. Always tired. Emily Carter." The subject. Her voice was delicate, fragile, laced with an exhaustion that seemed to seep through the decades. David leaned closer, straining to catch every syllable. "We understand you've been having some trouble sleeping," Finch continued, his tone even. "Can you tell us a bit more about that?" "The dreams," Emily murmured. "They're vivid. Too vivid. Always the same shadow. Always watching." Sarah Jenkins, the nurse, interjected, her voice warmer, more empathetic than Finch's. "Emily mentioned to me yesterday that she often wakes up in a cold sweat. Sometimes, she says, she hears whispers, even when she's fully awake." "Whispers?" Finch questioned. "Can you discern any words, Emily?" "No. Just a murmur. Like a crowd speaking underwater. And sometimes it feels like it's inside my head. Not just around me." Her voice trailed off, a shiver evident even through the old recording. The initial assessment continued, detailing a litany of symptoms that individually could be attributed to stress, anxiety, or even a nascent psychotic break. Severe insomnia, frequent headaches, a pervasive sense of unease, a feeling of being constantly observed, and occasional outbursts of irrational fear. Dr. Finch maintained his scientific detachment, systematically ruling out physiological causes, suggesting psychological interventions. Sarah Jenkins, however, sounded increasingly concerned, her questions probing beyond the clinical, seeking to understand the person beneath the symptoms. "Emily, you mentioned feeling a strange coldness in your room at night, even with the heat on. Can you describe that?" Jenkins asked. "It's not just cold," Emily replied, her voice gaining a slight edge of frustration. "It's heavy, like something is pressing down. And sometimes things move, just small things. A book falling off the shelf when no one's there. A door creaking open when I know I closed it." Finch cleared his throat. "Emily, we've reviewed your medical history. There's no family history of neurological disorders or severe mental illness. Your initial psychological evaluations indicated no underlying conditions that would explain these experiences. So you think I'm making it up?" Emily's voice was sharper now, a hint of anger surfacing. "Not at all, Emily. We believe you are genuinely experiencing these phenomena. Our goal is to understand the root cause, whether it's psychological, environmental, or something we haven't yet identified." Finch's tone was placating, but David could almost hear the skepticism in his carefully chosen words. The tape ended with Finch scheduling further psychiatric evaluations and a sleep study. David felt a knot tighten in his stomach. It was all so mundane, so clinical. Yet, the subtle undercurrent of dread in Emily's voice, the almost imperceptible hesitation in Finch's reassurances, it all spoke of something far more unsettling. He rewound the tape, then threaded the next one. Subject 04 Escalation Tape 2 of 9. The second tape began with a similar formality, but the atmosphere was immediately different. There was a palpable tension in the room. Recording initiated. Date: October 21, 1998. Attending personnel: Dr. Alan Finch, Sarah Jenkins. Subject: Emily Carter. "Emily, we've reviewed the sleep study results. They indicate severe sleep deprivation, but no unusual brain activity that would suggest seizures or other neurological events." Finch's voice was less assured now. "The nightmares have gotten worse," Jenkins interjected, her voice tight with worry. Emily has been waking up screaming. Last night, she described being held down by invisible hands. A low moan came from Emily. It speaks to me now. Not just whispers. Tells me things. Horrible things. What does it say, Emily? Finch asked, his voice still controlled, but David detected a tremor. Things about you, Emily breathed, her voice suddenly stronger, colder. About your wife, Dr. Finch. About the accident last year. The one you never talk about. A sharp intake of breath from Finch. Emily, how could you possibly know about that? His composure was clearly breaking. It knows, Emily whispered, a chilling, almost triumphant note in her voice. It knows everything. The tape captured the frantic shuffling of papers, a muffled exclamation from Jenkins. The scientific detachment had vanished. We also have reports from the night staff, Jenkins continued, her voice shaky. Objects in Emily's room have been found displaced. Her bed was overturned once. And there's been a persistent, inexplicable drop in temperature around her. I've witnessed it myself, Finch admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. A localized temperature drop of nearly 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with no discernible cause. And the whispers, I've heard them now too. Faint but distinct. Not in English. It's not English, Emily's voice cut in, eerily calm. It's older. Much older. It wants me to understand. David felt a cold shiver run down his spine. This was it. The turn. The point where the mundane slipped into the terrifying. Given the unusual nature of these phenomena, we've brought in an additional consultant, Finch announced, his voice regaining some professional semblance though strained. Father Michael O'Connell. Father O'Connell is a respected theologian and an expert in historical cases of spiritual affliction. A new voice entered the recording, deep and resonant, radiating an authority that was both comforting and unsettling. Good morning, Emily. My name is Michael O'Connell. I'm here to listen. A long silence on the tape. Then Emily's voice transformed. It was no longer fragile or tired. It was distorted, guttural, a sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of the recording itself. You bring the scent of dust and dogma. You bring the cross. It burns. A gasp from Jenkins. Finch muttered something inaudible. Father O'Connell's voice remained steady. Emily, I'm here to help you. Help me. The voice that came from Emily was mocking, ancient, layered with a malevolent amusement. You cannot help what has already been claimed. You cannot unbind what is already bound. Then a sudden violent thud, as if something heavy had been thrown against a wall. A strangled cry from Jenkins. Finch's voice panicked, shouting orders. Hold her. Sarah, get the sedative. She's too strong. The sounds of a struggle. Emily's distorted voice roaring now. A sound that was not human filled the room. The tape picked up a sickening crack, followed by a grunt of pain. It broke her wrist. Jenkins screamed, her voice bordering on hysteria. She just twisted it. Father O'Connell's voice, sharp and urgent, cut through the chaos. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I command you to release this vessel. The roar intensified, followed by a guttural, mocking laugh that seemed to echo from the depths of a bottomless pit. Then a sudden absolute silence. The hiss of the tape player was the only sound. David sat frozen, his hand hovering over the stop button. His breath hitched in his throat. The silence on the tape was more terrifying than the screams. It was the silence of something having been unleashed, something untamed. He felt a profound, bone-deep cold seep into his own room. A chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down on him, just as Emily had described. He glanced nervously around his apartment, the mundane shadows suddenly seeming to writhe and stretch. He had opened the door. And now, he was no longer just listening to a historical record. He was a part of it. He was a witness. And the thing that had been bound, the thing that had broken free in that room decades ago, felt suddenly terrifyingly close. The tape had stopped, but the echoing silence in his mind was deafening. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that this was just the beginning. The tape had stopped, but the echoing silence in his mind was deafening. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that this was just the beginning. Michael sat perfectly still in the flickering glow of his desk lamp, the old cassette player a silent sentinel beside the dead tape. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the stillness of his apartment. The air felt heavy, thick with an unseen presence, a residue of the raw terror he just witnessed. He swallowed, his throat dry. Eleanor Vance. The name repeated in his mind, a phantom whisper. St. Jude's Asylum. The images from the tape, the guttural sounds, the desperate pleas, they replayed in a loop, each iteration more vivid, more horrifying than the last. He reached out a trembling hand and pressed the eject button. The cassette clunked out, a mundane object holding such unspeakable power. He stared at the handwritten label. Subject 04, Eleanor Vance, Session 2. Session 2. The implication was immediate and terrifying. If there was a Session 2, there had to have been a Session 1, and possibly more. He looked around his small study, his gaze lingering on the dusty cardboard box from which he'd pulled this tape. It sat on the floor, half hidden beneath a stack of old journals he'd inherited from his estranged great-uncle, Arthur. Arthur had been a reclusive figure, a collector of forgotten things, a man rumored to dabble in the esoteric, though Michael had always dismissed it as eccentricities. Now a cold dread snaked through him. What else was in that box? For a long moment he considered putting the tape back, sealing the box, and burying it in the deepest corner of his attic, pretending he'd never found it. The rational part of his brain screamed for self-preservation, for denial. But the other part, the part that had always been drawn to the shadows and the unexplained, felt an irresistible pull. He had to know. He needed to know. What had happened to Eleanor Vance? What entity had taken root in St. Jude's? And why had his great-uncle, a man he barely knew, kept these recordings? He carefully placed the cassette back into its case, his fingers brushing against the worn plastic. His eyes drifted back to the box. He pulled it closer, the cardboard scraping softly against the hardwood floor. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed newspaper clippings and brittle photographs, were more tapes. Dozens of them. Some were labeled, some weren't. Many had similar cryptic notations. Subject 01, Subject 03, Subject 07. And there at the bottom, partially obscured by a faded map of a forgotten town, was another one. Subject 04, Eleanor Vance, Session 1. A morbid fascination took hold. He bypassed the others, his resolve hardening. He had to start at the beginning, understand the full scope of Eleanor's ordeal. But not tonight. Not yet. His nerves were frayed, his mind a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. He needed to ground himself, to find some shred of reality to cling to. He closed the box, pushing it away, but the presence he felt earlier seemed to linger, a cold spot behind his neck. He stood up, stretching his stiff limbs, and walked to the window. Outside, the city lights twinkled, a reassuring tapestry of human activity. But even that offered little comfort. He felt utterly alone, isolated by the terrifying secret he now carried. He spent the next few hours trawling the internet, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He searched for St. Jude's Asylum, Exorcism Philadelphia 1970s, guessing at the era based on the tape's quality, Eleanor Vance missing. The results were sparse, frustratingly so. St. Jude's Asylum did exist, an old Catholic institution for the mentally ill, but it had been shut down in the late 70s, its records sealed, its buildings eventually demolished to make way for a modern medical complex. There were a few historical articles, bland and factual, focusing on its closure due to outdated practices and funding issues. No mention of exorcisms. No mention of Eleanor Vance. It was as if she had been erased. The lack of information was almost as unsettling as the tape itself. How could such a profound, horrific event leave no public trace? Unless it had been deliberately suppressed. Michael's mind raced, connecting dots that might not even exist. His great-uncle, Arthur, had been a journalist in his younger days, before he became a recluse. Had he been investigating something? Had he been silenced? He felt a sudden chill, despite the warmth of his apartment. The overhead light in his study flickered once, twice, then settled back into a steady hum. He dismissed it as an old bulb, but a prickle of unease ran down his spine. He remembered the faint, almost imperceptible whispers on the tape, the feeling of something ancient and malevolent stirring. He tried to distract himself watching an old movie, but his mind kept drifting back to the tapes, to Eleanor. He felt a strange sense of responsibility, as if by listening, he had somehow become involved, a silent witness to a tragedy long past. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the entity on the tape or something connected to it had somehow reached out from the past and touched him. Around 3 a.m., exhausted but unable to sleep, Michael decided to try a different approach. He searched for Arthur Vance, Philadelphia journalist paranormal. This yielded a few more hits. A small independent blog dedicated to local urban legends mentioned Arthur Vance as a fringe investigator who had once claimed to possess proof of demonic possession related to an old asylum. The blog post was dismissive, calling him a crackpot, but it included a grainy photo of a younger Arthur, looking intense and determined, holding what looked suspiciously like an old reel-to-reel tape recorder. Proof of demonic possession. The words resonated with a terrifying clarity. So his great-uncle wasn't just an eccentric collector. He had been actively pursuing this, and he had documented it. Michael's gaze drifted to the box of tapes again. He felt a profound sense of foreboding, a deep-seated fear that he was about to uncover something truly dangerous. But the pull was too strong. He had to know what Arthur knew. He decided to listen to session 1 the next morning, when the sun was high, and the world felt a little safer. He needed to prepare himself. He needed to gather his courage. The next day, Michael woke up feeling heavy, his sleep fitful and plagued by vivid, unsettling dreams he couldn't quite recall. The first thing he noticed was the cold. His apartment, usually warm, had a distinct chill in the air, a damp, earthy smell that he couldn't place. He checked the thermostat. It was set to a comfortable 72 degrees. The windows were closed. He shivered, pulling on a thick sweater. He tried to rationalize it, old building, drafty, just his imagination, but the feeling of being watched intensified. He kept glancing over his shoulder, a nervous habit he hadn't had before. He made coffee, his hands still a little shaky. As he poured it, he noticed a faint, almost imperceptible whisper in the periphery of his hearing. It sounded like a dry rustling, like brittle leaves skittering across pavement, or something struggling to form words. He froze, straining to hear it again. Nothing. Just the hum of his refrigerator and the distant city sounds. "You're imagining things, Michael," he muttered to himself, trying to sound convincing, but he wasn't convinced. He walked into his study, the box of tapes waiting like a Pandora's box. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. He pulled out Subject 04, Eleanor Vance, Session 1. It looked identical to the other, unassuming, innocent. He slotted it into the cassette player, his heart thumping a rapid rhythm against his ribs. He pressed play. The tape began with a burst of static, then the familiar, slightly muffled voice of Reverend Miller, his tone calmer, more composed than it had been in Session 2. Recording October 14, 1974. Subject 04, Eleanor Vance. First session. Present. Reverend Miller, Sister Agnes, Dr. Elias Thorne. "Eleanor, can you hear us?" A faint, trembling voice, unmistakably Eleanor's, responded. "Yes, Reverend. I feel so tired. And cold." Her voice was weak, fragile, nothing like the guttural roars from the previous tape. Reverend Miller's voice was gentle. "Eleanor, we're here to help you. Can you tell us what you've been experiencing?" A long pause, filled with the soft rustle of fabric, perhaps Sister Agnes adjusting her habit. Then Eleanor spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "The dreams. Always the dreams. And the voice. It's inside me, Reverend. Tells me things. Horrible things." "What kind of things, Eleanor?" It wants me to hurt myself. To hurt others. It's always there, humming just beneath my thoughts. And the shadows. They move, Reverend. In the corners of my room they twist. They look like branches. Like something ancient." Michael leaned closer to the speakers, his breath held. This was it. The beginning. The insidious creep of the entity. The subtle torment before the full manifestation. He could hear the concern in Reverend Miller's voice, the professional detachment of Dr. Thorne, the quiet, prayerful presence of Sister Agnes. They were just starting to understand the horror they were up against. The tape continued, Eleanor describing increasingly disturbing phenomena. Objects moving on their own, strange symbols appearing on her skin, intense physical pain that doctors couldn't explain. She talked about a feeling of being consumed, of her own thoughts no longer being her own. The entity, whatever it was slowly, methodically taking her apart. Then a sudden sharp crackle of static, and a new sound, a low guttural growl, emanating directly from Eleanor. It was faint at first, a distant rumble, but it grew rapidly, overlaying her fragile voice. "Get out!" a voice shrieked, but it wasn't Eleanor's. It was deeper, coarser, filled with an ancient malice. "You trespass where you do not belong." Reverend Miller's voice, now laced with alarm. "Eleanor, fight it. Resist." But the growl intensified, becoming a roar. The sound of something heavy crashing to the floor. Sister Agnes cried out, a terrified gasp. Dr. Thorne's voice, usually calm, was now frantic. "Her eyes! Look at her eyes!" The growling escalated into a cacophony of distorted sounds, inhuman snarls mixing with what sounded like furniture being thrown, glass shattering. And then, clearer than anything, a voice, not Eleanor's, not the growling entity, but another voice, cold and precise, cutting through the chaos. "It has taken root, deeper than we anticipated. This is not merely possession. This is an awakening." Michael's blood ran cold. The voice was calm, almost academic, despite the terror unfolding around it. It wasn't Miller, Agnes, or Thorne. It was another man. Who was he? And what did he mean? An awakening. The tape ended abruptly, a sudden click followed by dead air. Michael stared at the cassette player, his hands clammy. This was worse than session 2. This was the moment the true nature of the evil had revealed itself, not just as possession, but as something far more ancient, far more profound. An awakening. He pulled the tape out, his mind reeling. He looked at the box, at the dozens of other tapes, each one a potential doorway to another nightmare. He felt a chilling certainty that the calm, precise voice on the tape belonged to his great-uncle, Arthur. Arthur had been there. He had witnessed it. And he had recorded it all. The cold in the room seemed to deepen, wrapping around him like an icy shroud. He heard it again, that faint, dry rustling, closer this time, almost in his ear. And then a whisper, so soft it might have been his own imagination, but undeniably there. "He watches." Michael froze, every muscle in his body rigid. He wasn't alone. That ancient thing, the entity that had awoken in Eleanor Vance, was here. And it knew he was listening. Michael's breath hitched, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. The words, "he watches," weren't just a chilling declaration from the tape. They were a direct, personal assault. His study, usually a sanctuary of quiet reflection, felt suddenly invaded, the air thick with an unseen presence. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He was observed. He instinctively reached for the stop button on the old reel-to-reel player, his fingers fumbling, slick with a sudden sweat. But even as his hand moved, a new sound, faint but distinct, emanated not from the speakers, but from the corner of the room near the antique bookshelf. A soft, almost imperceptible scratching, like dry fingernails dragging across wood. Michael froze again, his hand hovering over the player. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was heavier, more suffocating than any scream. He strained his ears, every nerve ending screaming at him to flee, but a morbid fascination, a terror-fueled curiosity, held him rooted. He told himself it was just the house settling, an old building making old noises. But the voice, that ancient guttural whisper, had been too specific, too personal. Then the tape resumed, a low hum preceding Eleanor's voice, now sounding even more strained, more desperate. She was speaking to Father Elijah, her words barely coherent. It knows what I think, Father. Puts thoughts in my head. Dark thoughts. About things I'd never do." Her voice cracked, a sob catching in her throat. "And it shows me things. Faces. Faces I don't know. But they're watching too." Michael felt a fresh wave of dread wash over him. Asterisk faces I don't know. But they're watching too. Asterisk, had the entity been showing Eleanor him? Was he one of the watchers it referred to? The thought was absurd, impossible, yet a chilling logic began to weave its way through his panic. He was listening to a recording from decades ago, yet the entity seemed to exist outside the confines of time and space, present here now in his study. He forced himself to take a shaky breath, trying to regain some semblance of control. This was a tape. Just a tape. His mind was playing tricks, amplifying the fear. He needed to be rational. He needed to understand. He leaned closer to the speakers, ignoring the prickling sensation on the back of his neck. Eleanor continued, her voice a ragged whisper. "It whispers names, Father. Names of places. And it says there's a door. A way out. Not for me. For it." Father Elijah's voice, calm but laced with a palpable weariness, responded, "Eleanor, we must resist. We must pray. This is its deception." "No," Eleanor cried out, a sudden burst of energy in her voice. "It's not deception. It's a promise. Terrible promise. Calls them the echoes. And it says they're hungry." The word echoes struck Michael. He'd seen it scrawled in Father Elijah's journal, alongside cryptic diagrams and references to ancient rites. He dismissed it as the ramblings of a man under immense spiritual duress, but now, hearing Eleanor speak it with such terror, it took on a new horrifying significance. He paused the tape again, needing a moment to process. The silence that descended was absolute, unnerving. The scratching sound didn't return. The feeling of being watched, however, intensified, a cold pressure against his skin, as if an invisible hand were pressing down on him. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on the shadows on the closed door. Nothing, yet everything felt wrong. His eyes fell on the journal, lying open on his desk. He picked it up, flipping through the pages until he found the section marked Subject 04, Eleanor Vance. His fingers traced the faded ink, the frantic scribbles. Asterisk entry 17. Subject exhibits profound dissociative episodes. Claims to see faces in the glass. Speaks of echoes longing for a way through. Appears to be a manifestation of a preternatural entity, not merely psychological distress. Asterisk. Asterisk entry 22. The entity's influence strengthens. Subject reports vivid nightmares, often involving a specific location. A forgotten well, overgrown with ivy, deep in the woods near her childhood home. Claims the echoes gather there. Asterisk. Michael's blood ran cold. The well. He remembered the mention of a well in the initial police report, a detail he dismissed as irrelevant. Eleanor Vance had been found near an abandoned well, deep in the woods behind her family's dilapidated farmhouse. The same farmhouse where the tapes were found, where Father Elijah had conducted his desperate rites. He continued reading Father Elijah's notes, his heart pounding in his chest. Asterisk entry 28. The entity is attempting to establish a more permanent conduit. It speaks of the unlocking. It uses Eleanor's voice to communicate with me. But its true voice is a cacophony of ancient whispers. It craves a physical anchor, a point of entry into our realm. Asterisk. Asterisk entry 35. I believe the entity is not merely possessing Eleanor, but using her as a vessel, a temporary bridge. It seeks to open a permanent portal. The well, it is more than just a location. It is a focal point, a place where the veil between worlds is thin. The echoes want out. Asterisk. A permanent portal. The well. The echoes. Michael felt a sudden terrifying clarity. This wasn't just a simple exorcism gone wrong. This was something far more ancient, more insidious. The entity wasn't trying to possess Eleanor. It was trying to use her to open a gateway. And the well was the key. He looked at the reel-to-reel player, then back at the journal. The pieces were beginning to fit, forming a grotesque mosaic of fear. He remembered the faint smell of damp earth and decay that had clung to the tapes, a smell he hadn't been able to place until now. It was the smell of the well, of things long buried and forgotten, stirring back to life. He pressed play again, the tape whirring back into motion. Eleanor's voice was now a mere whisper, interwoven with a guttural, inhuman growl that seemed to emanate not from her, but from through her. It wants me to go back," Eleanor rasped, her voice barely audible. "To the well. It says they're waiting." Father Elijah's voice, now filled with a desperate urgency, cut through the static. "No, Eleanor. You must not. We will bind it. We will seal it." A low, resonant chuckle, deep and ancient, echoed from the speakers. It wasn't Eleanor's. It was the entity's. "Foolish mortal," the voice hissed, a sound that seemed to scrape against Michael's very soul. "You cannot bind what has always been. You cannot seal what has already opened. The door is ajar. And the watcher, he listens." Michael flinched violently, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. The watcher. It was talking about him. The message was no longer ambiguous. This entity, trapped on a tape for decades, was aware of him, aware of his presence, and seemed to be communicating directly with him, through the conduit of Eleanor Vance's terrified voice. He scrambled backward, knocking his chair over with a clatter. His eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the overwhelming dread. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen pressure. The temperature plummeted, and he could see his own breath misting in the sudden chill. Then from the speakers the static intensified, rising to a piercing shriek that made his teeth ache. Amidst the white noise, he heard it again, not from Eleanor, but the entity's own voice, clearer this time, sharper, more present. He seeks the key. Michael's heart hammered against his ribs. The key? What key? Was it referring to the well? Or something else entirely? The sound of the shriek abruptly cut out, replaced by the faint, almost imperceptible sound of crying. It was Eleanor weeping, her voice small and broken. It showed me the others," she sobbed. "The ones who opened it before. They're still there, trapped, waiting for someone to join them." Michael felt a fresh wave of terror. The ones who opened it before. This wasn't the first time. The entity wasn't just looking for an opening. It was looking for reopening an existing one. And others had been consumed by it. He remembered Father Elijah's cryptic notes about the unfortunate souls who had vanished from the area around the Vance farmhouse over the decades. Local legends spoke of people disappearing without a trace, often near the old well. He dismissed them as folklore, but now, the tape continued, Eleanor's sobs slowly fading, replaced by a low rhythmic chanting. It wasn't in English or Latin, or any language Michael recognized. It was ancient, guttural, filled with a primal power that vibrated through the floorboards and into his bones. The sound was hypnotic, terrifying, twisting his insides into knots. He recognized the chant from Father Elijah's journal. The priest had transcribed some of it, noting it as the language of the old ones, a summoning ritual. But Father Elijah had never completed the transcription, claiming the words themselves caused him physical pain and mental anguish. As the chanting grew louder, the temperature in the room dropped further. Michael could see his breath in thick plumes. He wrapped his arms around himself, shivering violently, but it wasn't just the cold. It was the profound, soul-deep terror that gripped him. A faint, sickly sweet smell, like decaying flowers and damp earth, filled the air. It was that same smell from the tapes, amplified, sickeningly present. Then the chanting abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, deafening. Michael's ears rang. He stood there, frozen, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He waited, every muscle tensed, for something to happen. And something did. From the reel-to-reel player, not from the speakers, but from the actual spinning reels themselves, a faint, translucent mist began to rise. It shimmered with an ethereal greenish glow, twisting and coiling in the dim light of his study. It was cold, impossibly cold, and as it unfurled, it began to take on a vague humanoid shape. Michael stumbled backward again, hitting the wall with a thud. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't his imagination. This wasn't a trick of the light. An apparition, a spectral form, was manifesting directly from the tapes. The mist solidified slightly, revealing faint, skeletal outlines within. 2 pinpricks of red light flared within its vaguely defined head, like malevolent eyes. And then a voice, not from the speakers, but from the mist itself, a voice that was a chorus of whispers, ancient and hungry, echoed through his study, vibrating the very air around him. "You have listened, Watcher. Now you will see." The spectral form began to drift slowly, deliberately, away from the reel-to-reel player towards Michael. The cold intensified, piercing his bones. He could feel the entity's gaze, those burning red pinpricks, fixed on him, pulling him in, demanding his attention. Panic seized him, an icy wave that threatened to drown him. He had stumbled into something far greater, far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. The tapes weren't just a record, they were a trap. And he, Michael, was caught in its snare. He finally understood. The entity wasn't just observing him, it had chosen him. He was the next conduit, the next key, and it was coming for him. He wanted to scream, but no sound escaped his constricted throat. His legs felt like lead, refusing to move. The spectral form was closer now, its cold seeping into him, chilling him to his very core. He could almost feel its breath, the stench of decay and ancient earth on his face. This was not a nightmare. This was real, and it was just getting started. The icy grip tightened not just on his mind, but around his very throat, a phantom pressure that stole his breath. Michael stumbled backward, tripping over something unseen. the floorboards groaning in protest as he hit the ground with a sickening thud. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden, echoing silence. The spectral form didn't dissipate immediately. It simply receded. It didn't vanish in a puff of smoke or a flash of light, but rather seemed to draw back into the shadows, a slow, deliberate retreat, its form blurring at the edges as if the very air around it was consuming its substance. The biting cold lingered, a chilling residue that clung to his skin, raising goosebumps despite the warmth of the room. The stench of decay, that ancient, earthy odor, remained, a phantom smell that now seemed permanently etched into his nostrils. He scrambled backward on his hands and knees, his eyes wide and unfocused, straining to pierce the gloom. Was it still there? Was it waiting? His mind, usually so sharp, so analytical, was a chaotic mess of primal fear. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every creak of the old house a potential harbinger of its return. He pushed himself against the wall, his chest heaving, fighting to regain control over his own lungs. This wasn't a trick of the light. This wasn't exhaustion playing games with his perception. He had felt it. The cold, the breath, the presence. It was undeniably, terrifyingly real. For a long moment, he just sat there, trembling, trying to process what had just happened. The rational part of his brain screamed for an explanation. A scientific anomaly. A hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But the visceral terror that still vibrated through every fiber of his being refused to be silenced. He had seen things on the tapes, yes, horrifying things, but they were always mediated by a screen, a layer of separation. This was direct, personal, and it had found him. He eventually pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady. He needed light. More light. He fumbled for the nearest lamp, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it. The sudden flood of illumination did little to ease his dread. It merely chased the larger shadows away, leaving smaller, more insistent ones to dance at the periphery of his vision. He needed answers, and he knew with a sickening certainty that those answers lay within the tapes. He had to go back. He had to listen again, not as a detached observer, but as someone who was now directly involved, directly targeted. He stumbled back to the desk, his gaze fixed on the old reel-to-reel player. The tapes, silent and innocuous in their dusty boxes, now seemed to hum with a malevolent energy. He carefully rewound the last tape he'd been listening to, the one labeled Subject 04 Session 7. He pressed play, his finger hovering over the stop button, ready to cut the sound if even a whisper of that spectral presence returned. The familiar hiss and crackle filled the room. Dr. Eris Thorne's calm, clinical voice began again, detailing the deteriorating condition of the subject, Jessica Thorne. But Michael wasn't listening for the doctor's words anymore. He was listening for everything else. The subtle shifts in tone, the background noises, the moments of silence that were perhaps not so silent after all. He fast-forwarded through parts he'd already analyzed, his eyes scanning the notes he'd meticulously taken. He stopped at a section marked Unintelligible Whispers. Before, he'd dismissed them as poor recording quality, static interference. Now he leaned in closer, cranking the volume up to a level that made the speakers buzz. There it was, a low guttural murmur, almost swallowed by the tape hiss. It wasn't human. It wasn't even animal. It was something else entirely. A sound that seemed to vibrate from a place beyond comprehension. He isolated the segment, replaying it over and over. He tried to make out words, but it was just a chaotic jumble of sounds, clicks, and rasps. Yet there was a rhythm to it, a dark, pulsing cadence. He continued, moving to other tapes, other sessions involving Subject 04. He noticed patterns he'd previously overlooked. The temperature fluctuations Dr. Thorne mentioned, the sudden drops that always coincided with Jessica's episodes, the faint, almost imperceptible scent of decay that the doctor had initially dismissed as a pipe issue. It was all there, woven into the fabric of the recordings, a tapestry of escalating dread. Then he reached Subject 04 Session 9. This was a particularly harrowing session, where Jessica's voice had deepened, becoming harsh and guttural. Michael had previously focused on her words, the blasphemies and threats. Now, he listened for the silences between her words, and he found it. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound. It was consistent, repetitive, like nails dragging across a rough surface. He remembered the spectral form, its long skeletal fingers. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Could it be? Was that sound a manifestation of the entity even then? He replayed the scratching sound, amplifying it. It grew louder, eerier. And then, for a split second, cutting through the distorted noise, he heard something else. A faint whisper, almost a sigh, directly before Jessica spoke in the entity's voice. It was too quick, too soft to be understood, but it was there. A distinct, non-human sound, seemingly influencing Jessica. He spent hours painstakingly going through every minute of every Subject 04 tape, cross-referencing notes, listening for these new details. He started making a timeline, charting the entity's apparent patterns of manifestation. The cold, the smell, the whispers, the scratching. They were all present, subtly at first, then growing more pronounced with each session. His research expanded beyond the tapes. He went online, searching for anything related to the property, to Dr. Eris Thorne, to the name Jessica Thorne. He sifted through old property records, newspaper archives, local historical societies. The house itself had a surprisingly unremarkable history. Built in the 1920s, it had changed hands a few times, mostly uneventfully. No murders, no suicides, no reported hauntings. Until Dr. Thorne. Eris Thorne was a respected psychiatrist, specializing in dissociative identity disorder. His published works were extensive, his reputation impeccable. There was no mention of anything supernatural in his professional life. His death, a heart attack at 62, was reported as sudden but natural. But then Michael found a small, almost insignificant article in a local paper from 20 years ago. It was an obituary for a young woman named Emily Hayes. Died tragically at the age of 23. No cause of death was listed. The article mentioned she was a patient of Dr. Eris Thorne at the time of her passing. Emily Hayes. The name snagged in Michael's mind. It wasn't Jessica Thorne, but the connection to Dr. Thorne, and the sudden unexplained death of a young female patient, felt too coincidental. He dug deeper into Emily Hayes. He found a grainy photograph. A young woman, pale with haunted eyes. Her face was strikingly similar to the blurry image he'd glimpsed on one of the tapes, the one he'd assumed was Jessica Thorne. Could it be? Was Jessica Thorne an alias? Was Subject 04 actually Emily Hayes? A new, chilling thought began to form in his mind. If Jessica Thorne was an alias, why? And if Emily Hayes was the true subject, what happened to her? The obituary was vague, almost deliberately so. He kept digging, chasing down every lead, every whisper of information. He found an old forum dedicated to local history, a small forgotten corner of the internet. Someone had posted a question years ago, asking about the Thorne house, mentioning strange lights and sounds after Thorne's death. The post had been dismissed as urban legend, but one reply stood out. A user named Old Man River had written, "Thorne tried to bury it, but some things don't stay buried, especially when they're hungry." Hungry. The word resonated with a dark echo. He thought of the spectral form, its cold, its malevolent presence. He thought of the tapes, the escalating horror, the slow consumption of Jessica or Emily, or whoever Subject 04 truly was. He felt a sudden, profound shift in the atmosphere of the room. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. The subtle cold returned, not just in patches but pervasive, seeping into the very walls. The faint scent of decay, previously a phantom, now grew stronger, acrid and undeniable. He looked up from his screen, his heart pounding. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, to coalesce. And then from the reel-to-reel player, which he had paused hours ago, a faint, almost inaudible whisper drifted out. It wasn't from the speakers. It was from the machine itself, from the tape, a sound that seemed to emanate directly from the magnetic ribbon. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was thin, reedy like a dying breath, but undeniably clear. It was not the guttural growl of the entity he'd heard on the tapes, nor was it Jessica's or Emily's voice. It was a new voice, a third entity, or perhaps the true voice of the one claiming the house. Michael froze, his blood turning to ice. The words weren't a threat, not exactly. They were a warning, a possessive territorial declaration. He gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. The entity wasn't just manifesting. It was communicating directly with him, through the very medium he was using to uncover its secrets. And it knew he was there. It knew what he was doing. He was no longer just an observer. He was now a participant, trapped in a horrifying narrative that stretched back decades, a narrative that had just reached out and pulled him in. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. It wasn't just the chill that snaked up his spine, but a profound sense of being known. The glow from the monitor, previously just a window into a disturbing past, now felt like a spotlight fixed directly on him, exposing him. His breath hitched, caught in his throat. He wanted to rip his gaze from the flickering images, to turn off the machine, to run. But his muscles felt like lead. His eyes glued to the screen as if by an invisible force. The silence in his apartment, usually a comfort, had transformed into a vast echoing void, amplifying every frantic beat of his own heart. He tried to rationalize it away. It was just a story, just old footage. He was tired, his mind playing tricks. The late hours, the disturbing content. It was all getting to him. He reached for the remote, his hand trembling, intending to press stop, to eject the tape, to bury it in the deepest drawer and never look at it again. But his fingers, inches from the button, refused to obey. A cold dread, far more potent than any fear he'd felt before, rooted him to his seat. It was the dread of knowing that turning it off wouldn't make it go away. It was already here. It was already with him. He could feel it now, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a pressure against his eardrums, like descending into deep water. The shadows in the corners of his room seemed to deepen, to take on a life of their own, coiling and uncoiling at the periphery of his vision. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to dispel the illusion, but the sensation of being watched only intensified. When he opened them again, the monitor was still there, the paused image of a young girl, Sarah Jenkins, contorted in an impossible angle, her eyes black pits. And in those pits, he felt an ancient, malevolent intelligence staring directly into him. He forced himself to breathe, to push back against the panic clawing at his throat. He had to understand. If it was real, if it was truly reaching out, then understanding was his only weapon, his only chance. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry, and pressed play. The tape resumed, the grainy footage showing Father Michael, sweat beading on his brow, reciting Latin prayers with urgent desperation. Dr. Emily Hayes, the young psychologist, looked pale and shaken, her notes clutched tightly in her hand. Sarah thrashed, her voice a guttural roar, far too deep for a child. But this time as he watched, something new caught his attention. Flicker. Not in the footage itself, but on the footage. A brief, almost imperceptible distortion, like a glitch in the matrix, that seemed to emanate from Sarah. It was too fleeting to be a tape artifact, too precise. It was almost a message. He rewound frame by frame, his heart hammering. There it was again. A blink and you miss it anomaly. It happened just as Father Michael uttered a specific phrase, a particularly potent line of exorcism. And each time it happened, the distortion pulsed, almost like a ripple in water. It was a pattern, a signal. But what did it mean? He spent hours, days, even rewatching the tapes, not just the segments he'd meticulously cataloged, but every single frame of every tape, searching for more of these glitches. His apartment became a bunker, the outside world fading into irrelevance. Food was an afterthought, sleep a luxury he couldn't afford. The cold presence never left him, a constant, chilling companion. He started seeing things, a fleeting shadow in his peripheral vision, the distinct scent of ozone, the faint whisper of a child's name carried on a non-existent breeze. Was he losing his mind, or was this the entity's way of making its presence known, blurring the lines between the tapes and his reality? He found more. Not just on the tapes of Sarah Jenkins, Subject 04, but on other tapes he hadn't fully processed yet. Tapes labeled with cryptic codes: Project Nightingale, Subject 01, The Willow Creek Incident, Subject 02, Case File, The Markham Child, Subject 03. He hadn't given them much thought before, assuming they were related but separate cases. Now he saw the same subtle distortions, the same precise rhythmic pulses, appearing at key moments in their footage too. A chilling realization began to dawn on him. This wasn't just about Subject 04. Sarah Jenkins was part of a larger tapestry, a terrifying sequence. The decades-old narrative wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal timeline of similar events, meticulously documented, yet never connected by those who recorded them. He saw the same desperate priests, the same bewildered doctors, the same terrified families, all battling an unseen force that seemed to follow a horrifyingly consistent playbook. He started cross-referencing. The glitches he discovered weren't random. They occurred when the affected individual, the subject, was in a state of extreme distress or manifesting specific, unnatural abilities. And always when a particular phrase or symbol was present, he began to compile a new kind of data, a map of the entity's influence across multiple subjects across decades. Subject 01, a young man named James Miller in the late 1960s, exhibited extreme pyrokinesis, setting objects alight with a thought. Subject 02, a woman named Carol Peterson in the 1970s, displayed impossible strength, bending steel bars in her confinement. Subject 03, a boy named Thomas Markham in the 1980s, spoke in ancient, forgotten languages, predicting future events with terrifying accuracy. And then Sarah Jenkins, Subject 04, with her impossible contortions and the chilling clarity of her other voice. The pattern wasn't just about the physical manifestations, but something deeper. Each subject, before their possession escalated, had experienced a period of profound isolation, a traumatic loss, or a deep-seated vulnerability. The entity, whatever it was, seemed to prey on the broken, the lost, the ones whose spiritual defenses were weakest. He found a handwritten note tucked into a dusty file accompanying the Project Nightingale tapes. It was dated 1971, penned by a Dr. David Sean, a researcher who seemed to have been ahead of his time. The note read, "Observation. The entity does not merely possess, it assimilates. Each host is not just a vessel but a data point, an experiment. What is it learning? What is its ultimate goal? And why the escalation in abilities with each successive subject? Assimilation, data point, experiment." The words echoed in his mind, chilling him to the bone. This wasn't just a demon seeking a soul. This was something methodical, something with a purpose. And the glitches? They were a record of that assimilation, a unique signature left by the entity in its wake. He refocused on Sarah Jenkins, Subject 04. Her tapes were the most recent, the most complete. If this was an escalation, what new abilities or data had the entity gained from her? He watched a segment where Sarah, speaking in the deep, resonant voice, began to describe events from Father Michael's own childhood, secrets only he could know. It wasn't just knowledge. It was intimate, violating knowledge designed to break the priest's resolve. This was psychological warfare, refined and targeted. Then he saw it. A new kind of glitch unlike the others. It appeared not on Sarah, but on the recording equipment itself. A brief, almost subliminal flash across the lens. A momentary disruption in the audio feed. It happened precisely at the moment the entity, speaking through Sarah, made a direct, chilling promise to Father Michael. "Soon you will all know my true name. And then you will all be mine." His blood ran cold. The earlier glitches were a record from the subjects. This new one was different. It was a direct interaction with the recording medium. The entity wasn't just being documented, it was manipulating the documentation. It was leaving its mark not just on its victims, but on the very evidence of its existence. It was a signature, a brand, and if it could do that, what else could it do? If it could reach into the past, into the recording process itself, what was to stop it from reaching out? Out of the screen, out of the tapes, into the present, into his apartment, into him. The sudden flicker of the overhead light in his living room wasn't a coincidence. The faint, almost inaudible whisper of his own name, carried on a breath of cold air, was not his imagination. The feeling of a hand, cold and spectral, brushing against the back of his neck, was undeniably real. He was no longer just watching a horror story unfold on a screen. He was living it. The narrative had not only pulled him in, it was actively reaching for him, using the very tapes he was studying as a conduit. He was not just a participant, he was the next subject. Subject 05. And the entity, having learned and assimilated from decades of experience, was coming for him. And it had already left its mark. The mark wasn't visible, not in the way a scar or a bruise would be. It was deeper, an invisible stain on his very essence, and Michael felt it settle in the quiet corners of his mind, a cold, persistent hum beneath the surface of his thoughts. The immediate aftermath of that final chilling revelation from the tapes wasn't a sudden dramatic possession. It was far more insidious, a slow, creeping erosion of his reality. The first thing to go was sleep. Not just the quality of it, but the very concept of restful slumber. His nights became battlegrounds, vivid, terrifying dreams morphing into waking hallucinations. He'd see flickers of movement in the periphery of his vision, a shadow detaching from the wall, a distortion in the mirror that vanished the moment he focused. He'd hear whispers, faint at first, like static on an old radio, then growing clearer, forming words he couldn't quite grasp, yet felt profoundly unsettling. They sounded like the voices from the tapes, distorted and layered, speaking in unison, but this time they weren't contained within the magnetic strips. They were in his apartment, in his head. He tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it as stress, exhaustion, the psychological toll of immersing himself in such disturbing material. He was a man of science, a researcher. His mind was a fortress of logic. But the entity wasn't attacking his logic, it was attacking his sanity, his perception. It was subtly twisting the world around him, making him doubt everything he knew to be true. One morning, Michael found his carefully organized research notes scattered across his desk. Some pages ripped, others scrawled with symbols he didn't recognize, ancient glyphs that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. He remembered meticulously stacking them the night before, securing them with a heavy paperweight. He lived alone. There was no one else. He blamed himself, a moment of sleep-deprived carelessness perhaps, but a gnawing suspicion began to take root. He tried to confide in Jessica, his colleague, during a coffee break. He spoke vaguely about the intensity of his research, the psychological strain. Jessica, ever practical, suggested he take a few days off, clear his head. She noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly when he held his mug, but she couldn't see the true horror unfolding within him. He couldn't bring himself to tell her about the whispers, the shadows, the feeling of being watched, because even to his own ears it sounded like madness. The entity wasn't just observing, it was learning. Michael's every thought, every fear, every moment of doubt became data points for this ancient parasitic intelligence. It began to anticipate his actions. If he decided to turn on a light, the bulb would flicker violently before he even reached the switch. If he thought about listening to a specific tape to find answers, the player would mysteriously malfunction, or the tape itself would be missing, only to reappear hours later, rewound to a particularly disturbing segment. He started noticing patterns. The cold spots in his apartment, once random, now seemed to follow him, intensifying whenever he felt particularly vulnerable or alone. The whispers coalesced into fragments of sentences, personal accusations, twisting his own insecurities and regrets into sharp, verbal daggers. "You're alone, Michael. You always have been. And now you're ours." The tapes themselves became a conduit in a new, terrifying way. He found himself drawn to them, compelled to listen, even as they amplified his torment. He'd play a segment, hoping to find a clue, a weakness in the entity's methods, but instead, he'd hear his own name woven into the screams of Subject 04, distorted and mocking. He'd hear snippets of his own thoughts, his own fears, echoing back at him from the voices of the possessed. The entity was using the very material he was studying, the very tools he thought would help him understand, to further unravel him. One evening, while meticulously reviewing a transcript of a particularly violent possession from Subject 02, Michael felt an intense pressure on his chest, as if an invisible weight had settled upon him. He gasped for air, his heart hammering against his ribs. The room spun, and a profound sense of despair washed over him, a soul-crushing sadness that wasn't his own. He knew with a horrifying certainty that this was what the victims felt, the sheer, overwhelming agony of the entity's presence. He wasn't just studying their pain, he was experiencing it. He staggered to his feet, desperate to escape the suffocating presence, but it followed him. He saw his reflection in the dark window of his apartment, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, his eyes weren't his own. They were deep, fathomless pools of black, devoid of light or humanity, mirroring the eyes he had seen in the blurry, grainy footage of Subject 04. A scream caught in his throat, a primal sound of terror. He blinked, and his own frightened, bewildered eyes stared back. Was he going mad? Was this the final stage? He knew the progression from the tapes. The initial psychological torment, the physical manifestations, the loss of self leading to the ultimate surrender. He was racing down that path faster than any of the previous subjects. Why? Because the entity was already ancient, but now it had evolved. It had learned from decades of human hosts, decades of failures and successes. It understood the modern mind, the vulnerabilities of a man steeped in science and logic, and it was exploiting every single one. Michael locked himself in his apartment, disconnecting from the outside world. He stopped going to work, feigning illness, knowing that he couldn't expose Jessica or anyone else to what was happening to him. He was becoming Subject 05, and he was a danger to anyone who came near. He tried to fight back to find a pattern, a weakness. He devoured ancient texts on demonology, theology, anything that might offer a glimmer of hope. But the entity seemed to mock his efforts, subtly altering the pages of his books, making relevant passages disappear, or replacing them with taunting messages in a language he didn't understand, yet felt in his bones. His apartment became a battleground of wills. Lights flickered constantly. Objects flew across rooms. The temperature fluctuated wildly, from searing heat to bone-chilling cold. The whispers were now a constant chorus, echoing his darkest thoughts, his deepest fears. He saw apparitions in his peripheral vision, skeletal figures, distorted faces, the tormented visages of subjects 01 through 04, their eyes fixed on him, as if welcoming him to their shared nightmare. The entity's influence grew bolder. It began to manipulate not just his environment but his very perception of time. Hours would vanish, leaving him disoriented and confused, with no memory of what had transpired. He'd find himself in different rooms of his apartment, with no recollection of moving. He started noticing small, unnatural changes on his body, faint, almost imperceptible scratches appearing on his arms, a chilling coldness spreading from his extremities. He was losing control. The entity was tightening its grip, preparing for the final push, the complete usurpation. He picked up his phone, his trembling fingers fumbling with the keypad, desperate to call for help, to reach out to anyone. But as he brought the phone to his ear, he didn't hear a dial tone. He heard the faint, distorted voice of Subject 04, screaming his own name, "Michael!" followed by a chorus of demonic laughter that seemed to come not from the phone, but from the very air around him, from within his own skull. He dropped the phone, shattering it against the floor, its screen cracking like ice. He was truly alone. He was trapped, and the entity was ready to claim its prize. The silence that followed the phone's demise was not empty. It was a vacuum filled with the cacophony of his own unraveling mind. The fractured screen, a spiderweb of despair reflecting his own shattered resolve, lay at his feet, mocking him. He was truly cut off now, severed from the last vestiges of the outside world. The whispers, no longer confined to the periphery, erupted into a full-blown chorus within his cranium, 1,000 indistinguishable voices tearing at the fabric of his sanity. But then one voice broke through the din, clear as a bell, yet laced with an icy disdain he'd never heard in life. "Jessica's. You let me down, Michael." It hissed, not from the air, but from the very core of his being. "You always did. Chasing your ghosts, your theories, while I faded away." Michael stumbled backward, his hands flying to his ears, though he knew it was futile. The voice was inside him. He could see her too, not as a phantom, but as a vivid, agonizing hallucination. Jessica stood across the study, ethereal yet solid, her eyes empty, accusing. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips, once soft and inviting, were now thin, drawn lines of condemnation. He saw the hospital room, the sterile white, the slow, agonizing decline, all of it replayed with brutal clarity, amplified by the entity's malicious touch. "You loved your research more than you loved me," her spectral voice whispered, growing louder, more piercing. "You sought answers in the darkness, and now the darkness has come for you, just as it came for me. You are a failure, Michael. A failure as a husband, a failure as a scientist." Each word was a poisoned dart, striking at the deepest wounds of his soul. His breath hitched, tears blurring his vision as the entity expertly exploited his profound guilt, the gnawing regret that had eaten at him since Jessica's passing. He wanted to scream, to tell it to stop, to tell it that it wasn't true, that he had loved her more than anything. But the words caught in his throat, strangled by an invisible force. He felt a crushing weight descend upon his chest, pressing him down, stealing his air, until he was on his knees, gasping, staring up at the spectral image of his deceased wife. The air grew heavy, like breathing liquid lead, and a frigid cold seeped into his bones, a cold that felt ancient and malevolent, far beyond any natural chill. The bookshelves around him began to creak, the old wood groaning under an unseen pressure. Books, thousands of them, shivered on their shelves. Then, with a sudden violent shudder, a heavy tome of ancient languages flew from its perch, slamming against the wall with a deafening thud, sending a plume of dust into the frigid air. He was trapped. He tried to push himself up, to escape the suffocating presence, but his limbs felt like lead, unresponsive. He was a puppet, his strings held by an invisible, malicious puppeteer, twisting him, mocking his every futile effort. The entity wasn't just whispering anymore. It was actively manipulating his environment, his very physiology. The study, once a sanctuary of knowledge, had become a cage of terror. The ornate mahogany desk, Dr. Reed's desk, seemed to loom over him, its dark wood swirling with unseen shadows. As he struggled, his hand inadvertently brushed against the underside of the desk's top drawer. There was a faint click, a subtle shift. In his panic, he didn't register it immediately. The specter of Jessica was still there, closer now, her cold hand reaching out, her breath, icy and stale, ghosting across his cheek. He flinched away, a primal scream tearing through him, but it was silent, trapped in his throat. Then a small, almost imperceptible panel on the underside of the desk slid inward, revealing a shallow, hidden compartment. It was so well concealed, so deftly integrated into the old wood, that it could easily have gone unnoticed for decades. Inside, nestled amongst a few brittle, yellowed pieces of paper, was a small leather-bound journal. It was old, its cover worn smooth, its pages undoubtedly fragile. Michael, driven by an instinct he couldn't explain, a desperate, defiant spark in the face of absolute despair, reached for it. His fingers, trembling violently, closed around the cool leather. The entity seemed to sense this shift, this momentary distraction from its psychological torment. The vision of Jessica flickered, distorted, her face contorting into a grotesque mask of rage. The heavy weight on Michael's chest intensified, threatening to crush his ribs. He pulled the journal out, clutching it to him, his eyes scanning the frantic, looping script on the first page. It was Dr. Evelyn Reed's handwriting, unmistakable, yet far more desperate than in any of her published works. The entries were dated years after Subject 04's initial documentation, long after the official records claimed Reed had moved on to other research. These were personal, clandestine notes. He struggled to focus, the voices in his head screaming, the room shaking violently, books raining down around him like deadly hail. But one word, scrawled repeatedly, caught his eye: echo. He forced himself to read, his eyes darting across the page, piecing together the fragmented, terrified observations of the brilliant doctor. Reed had realized, too late, that the entity wasn't a demon in the traditional sense, not a malevolent spirit from hell conjured by some dark ritual. It was something far more insidious, a parasitic entity she termed an echo. It fed, she wrote, not on blood or fear alone, but on obsession, on doubt, and most powerfully on unresolved grief. It was drawn to minds that sought forbidden knowledge, minds that were intellectually rigorous but emotionally vulnerable. It didn't possess in the conventional way. It mimicked and amplifies. It created illusions, whispers, and visions tailored specifically to its host's deepest fears and desires, slowly eroding their sanity, pushing them to the brink, until they willingly surrendered their consciousness, their very identity, to its influence. Subject 04, Reed surmised, was not a demonically possessed individual, but a victim whose mind had been completely consumed by this echo, leaving only a hollow shell animated by its parasitic will. Michael's blood ran cold, a different kind of terror replacing his initial panic. Everything clicked into place. His own relentless pursuit of Subject 04's case, his desperate need for answers after Jessica's death, his nagging self-doubt as a scholar. He had been a perfect target. The whispers, Jessica's voice, the visions, they weren't real. They were carefully crafted illusions, designed to break him, to drain him of his will, to make him surrender. He was feeding it. His despair, his guilt, his fear, his very obsession with understanding it, all were sustenance for this parasitic echo. Reed's journal continued, her hand growing shakier with each entry. She had discovered that conventional exorcism rituals were useless, even counterproductive, as they often amplified the host's fear and doubt, providing more fuel for the echo. The only way to combat it, she theorized, was to deny it, to reject its illusions, to find inner peace amidst the chaos, to starve it of the emotional energy it craved. It could not possess a mind that was truly aware of its deception, a mind that consciously chose to resist its fabricated reality. But there was another, more chilling detail. The echo, Reed believed, required an anchor, a physical object or a specific, deeply ingrained belief to maintain its persistent hold, especially when confronted with resistance. Without its anchor, it would weaken, perhaps even dissipate. She hadn't found it, but she suspected it was something subtle, something personal to Subject 04, or perhaps even something tied to the house itself. As Michael absorbed this terrifying, yet strangely empowering revelation, the entity exploded in a paroxysm of pure, unadulterated fury. It sensed its grip loosening, its carefully constructed reality beginning to crumble under the weight of Michael's newfound understanding. The spectral Jessica vanished, replaced by a swirling vortex of shadow and piercing red light that pulsed from the center of the room. The air shrieked, the very structure of the house groaning as if under the strain of an earthquake. Bookshelves splintered, glass shattered, and the heavy oak desk itself began to crack down the middle. A guttural roar, not human, not animal, but something ancient and utterly alien, tore through the space, echoing from every corner, vibrating in Michael's teeth. It was a sound of pure, unbridled malice, a final desperate attempt to overwhelm him, to shatter his resolve before he could act on the terrifying truth he had just uncovered. The echo was no longer just a whisper. It was a storm, a hurricane of psychic energy and raw, destructive power, intent on silencing him forever. Michael clutched the journal to his chest, his eyes wide, fixed on the swirling vortex of shadow that now filled the study. He knew its secret. He knew its weakness. But could he possibly find the strength, the inner peace, to fight back against a force that could twist his very reality? And could he possibly discover its anchor before it consumed him entirely? David stood amidst the swirling chaos of the study, a maelstrom of distorted reality. The books on the shelves melted into streams of ink, the antique desk warped into a grotesque, snarling face, its drawers like gaping maws. Yet a sliver of clarity remained in his mind, a fragile shield against the onslaught. He understood now. The entity wasn't merely manifesting. It was feeding on his fear, on his despair, on the very fabric of his memories and emotions, using them as fuel to twist the world around him. Its weakness, he realized, was its dependence on him. It needed his terror, his connection, to sustain its elaborate charade. Without a host, without a mind to prey upon, it was nothing but a whisper in the void. But knowing this was one thing, acting upon it was another. The air grew thick, heavy with an unseen pressure that threatened to crush him. The silence was no longer empty. It was a roaring void, filled with the echo of his own frantic heartbeat. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe, to find that elusive inner peace he desperately needed. The entity thrived on chaos, on panic. If he could starve it of its sustenance, even for a moment, he might gain an advantage. When he opened his eyes, the study was gone. He stood on a desolate, windswept beach, the gray ocean stretching infinitely before him under a sky the color of bruised plums. The sand beneath his feet was cold, gritty, and as he looked down, he saw it wasn't sand at all, but countless shards of broken glass, reflecting a distorted image of his own terrified face. A deep guttural laugh echoed from the crashing waves, a sound that was both familiar and utterly alien, a mockery of every joy he had ever known. "You think you understand, David?" A voice slithered into his mind, cold and sharp as a razor. "You merely glimpsed the surface of my power. Your fear, your grief, they are exquisite. They are mine." He squeezed his eyes shut again, fighting the urge to scream. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. He needed to find the anchor, the thing that tethered this entity to his reality, to this house. He knew it was here, somewhere in the study, woven into the very fabric of the place. He had to remember what Michael had said, what Emily had felt. The house was a cage, a conduit. When he opened his eyes this time, he was back in the study, but it was different. It was pristine, as it might have looked a century ago. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth. Everything was perfect, too perfect. And then he saw her. Jessica sat by the fireplace, a book open in her lap, her head tilted slightly, a soft smile gracing her lips. She looked up, her eyes wide and loving. "David, you're home early." His breath hitched. His heart ached with a longing so profound it was physical. This was the entity's cruelest trick yet. He wanted to run to her, to hold her, to tell her everything was going to be okay. But he knew it wasn't her. It was a phantom, a beautiful, devastating illusion. "Jessica," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He forced himself to take a step back, away from her outstretched hand. "You're not real." Her smile faltered, replaced by a look of hurt, of confusion. "What are you talking about, David? Are you feeling all right? You look pale." She rose, concern etched on her face, and started towards him. Every fiber of his being screamed to embrace her, to lose himself in the comforting lie. But he remembered the cold, the decay, the way the entity had twisted others. This was a test, a deliberate attempt to break his resolve. He had to resist. "This is not real," he repeated, louder this time, his voice shaking. He looked around the room, searching for the telltale signs of the entity's presence, for the cracks in the illusion. The sunlight, so warm and inviting, felt wrong. The fire, so comforting, cast no shadows. The Jessica illusion stopped, her expression hardening. Her eyes, once filled with love, now held a chilling emptiness. "You reject me, David? After everything we've been through? After everything I sacrificed for you?" Her voice grew colder, sharper, losing its familiar warmth. He felt a surge of anger, a dangerous emotion the entity would undoubtedly feast upon. He pushed it down, focusing instead on his goal, the anchor. He scanned the pristine room. What would be out of place? What would betray the illusion? His gaze fell upon the antique grandfather clock in the corner. Its pendulum swung with a rhythmic, almost hypnotic tick-tock. But something was off. The hands were spinning wildly, not keeping time, but cycling through hours and minutes at an impossible speed. A tiny, almost imperceptible detail in an otherwise flawless deception. "The clock," he murmured, pointing at it. "It's wrong." The Jessica illusion's face twisted into a snarl, a flash of something ancient and malevolent in her eyes. The perfect room began to ripple, the sunlight flickering, the walls wavering like reflections in disturbed water. "You look for flaws, David?" The entity's voice boomed, no longer attempting to mimic Jessica. "You seek to dismantle my carefully crafted world? Fool! Your world is the flaw." The room plunged into darkness, the brief warmth and light replaced by an oppressive chill. The grandfather clock began to chime, not with the gentle melody of time, but with a deafening, discordant clang that vibrated through his bones. Each chime was a hammer blow against his sanity, a relentless assault on his ears and mind. He stumbled backwards, covering his ears, but the sound was inside him, an echo in his skull. He could feel the entity pressing in, trying to force him to break, to succumb to the noise, to the despair. But he wouldn't. He couldn't. Despite the agony, he forced himself to think. The clock. Why the clock? Was it simply a detail it overlooked, or was there something more profound? Time. The entity played with time, with memories. Could the anchor be related to time itself, or an object that had witnessed countless moments within this house? He dropped his hands, forcing himself to look at the clock, even as the chimes threatened to shatter his eardrums. Its dark wood gleamed ominously, its face a swirling vortex of numbers and symbols that shifted and reformed. He felt a desperate urge to smash it, to silence the agonizing noise. But instinct told him that was exactly what the entity wanted, a violent outburst, a release of pure, unfiltered rage and fear. He closed his eyes again, not to escape, but to focus. He pushed back against the noise, against the fear, against the despair. He remembered Jessica's face in his mind, her real face, full of life, not the entity's cruel mimicry. He remembered his mother's gentle touch, the warmth of her hand in his. He remembered Michael's unwavering belief, Emily's quiet strength. He wasn't alone. He couldn't give up. A strange calm began to settle over him, not a peace born of surrender, but a defiant, focused stillness. The chimes, though still deafening, seemed to lose some of their power. He could hear them, but they no longer pierced him as deeply. He was creating a barrier, a mental shield. He opened his eyes and walked towards the clock. The entity roared, a sound that shook the very foundations of the house, manifesting as a chilling gust of wind that slammed into him, threatening to knock him off his feet. He staggered but kept moving, his hand outstretched. As he got closer, the clock's surface began to shimmer, revealing fleeting images within its polished wood. A young woman in an old-fashioned dress, her face etched with sorrow. A man with haunted eyes clutching a locket. A blurry, distorted figure lurking in the shadows of the study. These weren't just random images. They were memories, fragments of lives lived and lost within these very walls. The entity was trying to overwhelm him with a torrent of despair, an ocean of past suffering. But David saw something else. Amongst the swirling images, one stood out clearer, more defined. It was a small, ornate key, not unlike the one he had found in the locket, but older, more intricate. It was engraved with a symbol he couldn't quite decipher, a twisted knot of lines that seemed to writhe even as he looked at it. The key was not part of the clock's design. It was an image within the wood, almost like a faint engraving, pulsating with a faint internal light. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface of the clock. "No!" the entity shrieked, its voice a cacophony of agony and fury. The room began to spin violently, the walls blurring into streaks of color. The floor tilted, throwing him off balance. He felt himself falling, tumbling through an endless void. He could hear Jessica's voice pleading, screaming his name, then his mother's, then Michael's, all twisted into a chorus of terror and accusation. He fought against the disorientation, clinging to the image of the key, to the faint hope it represented. He knew he was close. The entity's desperate counterattack proved it. It was protecting something. The key. It had to be the key. But what did it unlock? And where was the actual key? Was it another illusion or a signpost? He hit something hard, the impact jarring his teeth. He lay sprawled on the floor, the world still spinning, his head throbbing. The deafening chimes of the clock were gone, replaced by a low guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very air around him. He pushed himself up, his muscles aching, his vision blurry. He was back in the study, but it was worse than before. The room was bathed in an unnatural, flickering red light, like the glow of dying embers. Shadows danced on the walls, elongating and twisting into monstrous forms. The books on the shelves were torn, their pages fluttering like frantic wings. The desk was overturned, its contents strewn across the floor. And the grandfather clock. It stood silent, its face cracked, its hands frozen at an impossible hour. But on its polished wooden surface, where he had seen the image of the key, there was now a faint, almost invisible indentation, barely perceptible to the touch. It was a mark, a symbol precisely matching the one he had seen on the illusory key. He traced the symbol with his finger, a chill running down his spine. It was a sigil, an ancient mark of binding or release. The entity had tried to hide it, to overwhelm him, but in its desperation, it had inadvertently shown him the way. The key wasn't physical, not yet. It was a symbol, a clue. And it was tied to the clock, to time, to the history of this cursed house. The anchor wasn't an object, it was a connection, a resonance. And that symbol, it was the beginning of unraveling it all. He had found a piece of the puzzle, a crucial link in the chain, but the entity was far from defeated, and its fury was now absolute, an inferno stoked by his defiance. The final confrontation was drawing near, and David knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he might not survive it. The air in the room thickened, not just with the oppressive weight of the entity's rage, but with a palpable foul humidity that clung to David's skin. The guttural snarl that erupted from Michael's throat wasn't merely loud. It was an acoustic assault, a waveform of pure malice that vibrated through David's bones, threatening to shatter his resolve. The room itself seemed to writhe, the shadows on the walls dancing with a frantic, impossible energy. Sarah gasped, stumbling back against Alex, who instinctively wrapped an arm around her, his own face a mask of horrified awe. David, however, stood his ground, the crucifix still clutched in his trembling hand, its silver now feeling searingly hot against his palm. He could feel the entity's tendrils of malevolence probing his mind, attempting to exploit every fear, every doubt, every past failure he had ever known. Images flashed before his eyes. The faces of loved ones, twisted into grotesque parodies, accusatory whispers echoing in his ears, reminding him of every mistake, every moment of weakness. It was a psychological onslaught designed to break him, to make him question his faith, his purpose, his very sanity. But David had faced similar attacks before. He closed his eyes for a fleeting second, grounding himself, pushing back against the torrent of negativity. "You may show me my past," he roared, his voice strained but firm. "But you do not own my future. You do not own Michael." The entity shrieked, a sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. Michael's head snapped back, his eyes, now pure incandescent white, fixing on David with an intensity that promised utter annihilation. The chains binding Michael to the bed groaned under an invisible strain, the metal links stretching and warping as if made of soft clay. His body levitated an inch off the mattress, then two, then three, a clear demonstration of the entity's unbridled power. "You speak of ownership, mortal?" the entity hissed, its voice layered with 1,000 suffering souls. each word a venomous dart. You are merely a pawn in a game far older than your fleeting species. This vessel, this boy, he was chosen for a purpose you cannot comprehend, a purpose that will bring about a new age. A new age? David's mind raced. What did it mean? He had always assumed these possessions were about torment, about destruction, about petty malice. But a new age? That implied a larger, more sinister design. Could this entity be different from the others he had encountered? More ancient? More powerful? He remembered the faint, almost imperceptible symbol he had seen etched into the wall behind Michael's bed frame when the room had briefly lit up. It wasn't a symbol of any known demonic sigil he recognized from his extensive studies. It was something else, something archaic, almost primordial. He hadn't had time to dwell on it then, dismissing it as a random scratch or an old stain. But now, with the entity speaking of purpose and a new age, a cold dread began to settle in his stomach. This wasn't just a simple exorcism. This was a battle for something far greater. What purpose? David demanded, stepping forward, ignoring the searing pain in his hand from the crucifix and the ringing in his ears. What new age? Michael's levitating body began to spin slowly, his limbs flailing like a puppet on severed strings. The entity laughed, a bone-rattling sound that vibrated through the floorboards. Ignorance is bliss, isn't it, David? But knowledge can be a weapon used against the very fabric of your reality. Suddenly, Michael's body shot forward, still tethered by the chains, but straining them to their absolute limit. The bed frame groaned, metal screeching against metal as the entire structure threatened to collapse. David barely had time to react, raising the crucifix defensively. The entity didn't make physical contact, but a wave of pure force slammed into David, sending him sprawling backward. He hit the wall with a sickening thud, the air knocked from his lungs. The crucifix flew from his grasp, skittering across the floor and coming to rest near Michael's feet. "David!" Sarah screamed, her voice hoarse with terror. Alex was already rushing forward, but David waved him back, gasping for breath. "Stay back. It's too dangerous." The entity, sensing David's momentary vulnerability, pressed its advantage. It began to whisper, not in the guttural snarl, but in a voice that was eerily soft, seductive, almost human. It sounded like Michael, like the boy he was trying to save. "He's tired, David. He's been fighting for so long. He wants peace. He wants to rest. Just let him go. Let me go. It will all be over." This was a new tactic, a psychological ploy designed to wear down his compassion. David knew it was a lie, a trick, but a part of him, a deeply human part, yearned for it to be true. He could see the exhaustion etched onto Michael's face beneath the demonic contortions, the faint tremor in his limbs. Was he truly prolonging Michael's suffering? He pushed the thought away, forcing himself to focus. He had to retrieve the crucifix. It was his only tangible weapon, a symbol of his faith and authority. He scrambled forward, crawling on his hands and knees towards the glint of silver. As he reached for it, a sudden jolt pulsed through the room. The lights flickered violently, then died completely, plunging the chamber into absolute darkness, save for the faint, unnatural glow emanating from Michael's eyes. In the sudden void, the entity's presence intensified, becoming a palpable, suffocating weight. "You seek your trinket?" the entity sneered, its voice now surrounding him, coming from all directions. "It is meaningless. A child's toy against true power." David felt a sharp, burning sensation on his bare skin. He cried out, pulling his hand back. He looked down, though he could barely see in the gloom, and realized his hand was bleeding. The crucifix had been superheated, its metal now glowing a dull, menacing red. It was a clear warning. He couldn't touch it. Not yet. He was disarmed, vulnerable. Panic, cold and insidious, began to creep in. He was losing control. Michael's body began to convulse violently, the chains rattling furiously, each shake more powerful than the last. He could hear the distinct sound of tearing wood as the bolts holding the bed to the floor began to rip free. "It's going to break free," Sarah cried, her voice laced with pure terror. Alex, ever practical, was already fumbling with his equipment, trying to get the backup lights on, but the entity's power seemed to be interfering with everything electronic. Sparks flew from the overhead fixtures, and the hum of the recording equipment sputtered and died. The only sound was the entity's malevolent laughter and Michael's agonized groans. David knew he had to think fast. He remembered the archaic symbol, the one he had dismissed earlier. What if it wasn't just a random mark? What if it was a key, a seal, or even a weakness? His knowledge of demonology was vast, but this entity felt different. It wasn't adhering to the usual rules. He took a deep, shuddering breath. If he couldn't use his usual tools, he had to improvise. He had to reach Michael, to reach the boy buried beneath the malice. He had to find a way to break the entity's hold, not just repel it. He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in his head and the growing numbness in his limbs. He could feel the entity's presence swirling around him, a tangible storm of malevolence. He extended his hands, not in a gesture of attack, but of desperate, pleading connection. "Michael!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the darkness. "Michael, if you can hear me, fight it. Fight for your life. Fight for your soul." The entity's laughter intensified. "He cannot hear you, fool. He is gone. Merely a husk, a puppet for my will." But David saw a flicker, a momentary hesitation in the incandescent white eyes. A brief, almost imperceptible tremor ran through Michael's levitating body that wasn't part of the entity's furious convulsions. A tiny spark of resistance deep within. He had to exploit it. He remembered a passage from an ancient text, rarely used, almost forbidden. It spoke of certain deeply entrenched entities that could only be dislodged by a direct appeal to the host's core identity, by reminding the soul of its true self, its true name, its true purpose before the possession. It was risky, incredibly risky, as it opened the exorcist to direct psychic assault, but it was his only option. He closed his eyes again, focusing not on the entity, but on Michael. He pictured the boy, the innocent, healthy boy he had seen in the family photos. He pictured his name, Michael, etched into his very being. "Michael," David whispered, then louder. "Michael, remember your mother's smile. Remember your father's laughter. Remember your dog, Buster. Remember your favorite tree in the park. Remember who you are. You are not this darkness. You are light. You are a son, a friend, a human being." The entity roared, a sound of pure agony and fury. This attack was different. It wasn't a physical blow, but a direct assault on its very essence, on its control over Michael's identity. Michael's body began to thrash even more violently, but this time, it seemed less like the entity's rage and more like a desperate, internal struggle. The chains, however, were giving way. With a final ear-splitting shriek of tearing metal and splintering wood, the bed frame exploded outwards. The chain snapped, whipping violently through the air. Michael's body, now completely untethered, hung suspended in midair, twitching, convulsing, his face contorting in a horrifying battle between his own tortured humanity and the entity's absolute dominion. "You dare to interfere with my harvest?" the entity shrieked, its voice now laced with a raw, primal fear that David had never heard from it before. "You will pay for this insolence with your very soul." A sudden, intense pressure slammed into David's chest, throwing him back against the wall again, harder this time. He felt a sharp crack, his breath catching in his throat. His vision blurred, spots dancing before his eyes. But even as darkness threatened to consume him, he saw it. For a fleeting moment, as the bed frame collapsed and the chain snapped, the light from Michael's eyes flared, and the archaic symbol on the wall behind where the headboard had been, the one David had dismissed, glowed with an eerie, faint blue light. And as Michael's body thrashed, his hand, for a split second, pointed directly at it. It wasn't a random scratch. It was a key, a weakness, a way. David's consciousness began to fade, the pain overwhelming, but he knew. He had found it, the entity's weakness. But he was critically injured, and the entity was now completely free. The final desperate move would have to come from somewhere else. Or perhaps from a strength he hadn't yet realized he possessed. The terror in the entity's voice gave him a sliver of hope, even as his world went dark. His world didn't just go dark, it shattered. It wasn't the darkness of unconsciousness, but the crushing infinite black of a void that swallowed light, sound, and even thought. He felt his own consciousness fragmenting, each piece dissolving into an overwhelming sense of cosmic insignificance. This was the entity's true domain, a place where existence was a meaningless flicker, and oblivion was the only truth. He was floating, or perhaps falling, through an endless, formless expanse. There was no up, no down, no time, only the pressure of absolute nothingness pressing in on him, threatening to erase his very being. The entity's voice, no longer a guttural growl, but a pervasive whisper that resonated within his very bones, surrounded him. It spoke in a language of despair, weaving thoughts directly into his mind. Asterisk, she is nothing. You are nothing. All your striving, your science, your petty beliefs, dust. Less than dust. A momentary ripple in the endless dark, soon to be smoothed away. Why resist? Why prolong the inevitable? Join the quiet. Join the stillness. Let it all dissolve. Asterisk. Alan felt a terrible pull. A siren song of absolute surrender. The thought of simply letting go, of ceasing to exist, was strangely comforting in its finality. The pain, the fear, the responsibility, all would vanish. Emily, Father Michael, Jessica, David. They would become mere concepts, fading echoes in the vast, indifferent void. His scientific mind, usually so precise, so ordered, found itself struggling against the logic of ultimate entropy. What was anything truly in the face of eternity? But then a flicker. A memory. It wasn't a grand revelation, but a small, stubborn image. Emily's face, pale and terrified, but still there, still human, before the entity took hold. He remembered her laughter, her kindness, the way her fiancé David looked at her. He remembered Jessica's fierce protectiveness. These were not abstract concepts, they were real. They held meaning. And then his own voice, or rather, the echo of his own thoughts from his research, from the hours spent poring over ancient texts and modern theories. The entity fed on meaninglessness. It devoured purpose. It thrived where there was no light, no hope, no reason to exist. Its terror, that fleeting moment of pure, unadulterated fear he had heard, had been because he had not given up. Even as his world went dark, even as he faced what he knew was ultimate defeat, a part of him had still been searching for an answer, a solution, a reason. That was it. The entity couldn't comprehend meaning. It couldn't destroy it either, only consume it from those who surrendered it. His scientific method, his relentless pursuit of understanding, his stubborn insistence on imposing order on chaos, these were its antithesis. He might not understand what it was, but he understood how it operated. And that understanding, that refusal to accept its premise of universal meaninglessness, was his weapon. "You lie," Alan projected, his thought a defiant spark in the suffocating darkness. It felt like shouting into a hurricane, but he pushed, drawing on a wellspring of resolve he hadn't known he possessed. Asterisk, you are not the void. You are merely a shadow within it. You are not the end of all things, but merely a parasite that feeds on the fear of it. Asterisk. The whispers intensified, growing agitated, losing their smooth, seductive quality. Asterisk, fool. You grasp at straws. You cling to illusion. There is no meaning. Only the inevitable decay. Asterisk. No, Alan countered, his mental voice gaining strength, drawing on every lecture he'd given, every paper he'd written, every moment he'd spent trying to decipher the mysteries of the universe. Meaning is not given, it is created. By us. By the connections we forge. By the lives we live. By the truth we seek. You cannot erase an idea, only silence the one who holds it. But ideas are stronger than you. Emily matters. Her life has value. And I will not let you take it. He began to focus, not on fighting the entity with spiritual force, but with intellectual clarity. He started to define it. He mentally cataloged its properties, its methods, its weaknesses, just as he would any unknown phenomenon in a lab. Asterisk, it is a being of non-existence, feeding on despair. Its power is derived from the absence of hope. It cannot tolerate definition, for definition imposes meaning. It cannot tolerate purpose, for purpose is its antithesis. Asterisk. As he solidified these thoughts, as he refused to let the entity's nihilism infect him, the infinite black around him began to buckle. The oppressive pressure eased, replaced by a terrible guttural shriek that was no longer a whisper, but a raw, tortured sound of pure agony. It was the sound of something ancient and formless being forced into a shape it abhorred, of something that thrived on the unknown being relentlessly defined. The entity recoiled, its voice a cacophony of enraged, incomprehensible screams. It was being pushed back, not by prayer or holy water, but by the relentless, unyielding force of human intellect and will. Alan felt a searing pain, as if his mind was being ripped apart, but he held on, pouring every ounce of his being into the counter-assault. Asterisk, you are an echo, a shadow, a temporary aberration. You have no true power, only what we surrender to you. Asterisk. With one final desperate surge of mental energy, Alan focused on Emily, on the image of her healthy, vibrant self. He pushed the entity's influence away from her. A wave of defiant, protective will. The entity shrieked again, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror and hatred, and then with a sensation like being violently ejected from a vacuum, Alan was thrown back into his own body. He gasped, a ragged, choking sound, as if he'd been underwater for an eternity. The room was still dark, lit only by the flickering emergency lamp. The air was thick and heavy, charged with an almost palpable malevolence, but it felt different, less suffocating. Emily was still on the cot, convulsing violently, but the movements were different now. Less controlled, more desperate. Her body was writhing, not in the entity's mimicry, but in a struggle of its own. Father Michael was still in the corner, his face ashen, still whispering prayers, his rosary clutched tight. He looked up, his eyes meeting Alan's in the dim light, and a flicker of understanding, of awe passed between them. The entity was still in Emily, but it was trapped. It was fighting, roaring its defiance, but it was no longer in control. Its hold had been broken. Alan had created a breach. "Michael," Alan croaked, his voice raw, his throat burning. "Now, push it out. It's vulnerable." Father Michael, his hands shaking, rose to his feet. His eyes, though still filled with exhaustion, now held a renewed, fierce determination. He began to chant, his voice low but resonating with a power Alan hadn't heard before. It wasn't just the Latin words, it was the conviction, the absolute belief in the inherent good of humanity, in the sacredness of life, that pulsed within each syllable. Emily's body arched, a terrible, inhuman scream tearing from her throat, a sound that seemed to rip the very fabric of the air. It wasn't Emily's voice, not anymore. It was the entity, enraged, in agony, trying desperately to cling to its host. The room grew colder, impossibly cold, and shadows danced wildly, seeming to coalesce and dissipate at the edges of their vision. Then a sudden violent lurch. Emily's body went rigid, her back arching impossibly high, a sickening crack echoing through the small room. Her eyes, wide and black, fixed on Alan. For a moment he saw pure, ancient malice, a hatred so profound it threatened to dissolve him on the spot. But beneath it, a flicker of something else, fear. The entity was terrified. With one final earth-shattering shriek, a sound that curdled the blood and tore at the mind, a dark, amorphous mass seemed to tear itself from Emily's mouth. It was a fleeting, shapeless thing, like smoke given malevolent intent, and it surged towards the ceiling, smashing against the concrete with an invisible force that shook the entire room. A chilling, defeated sigh seemed to echo through the air as it dissipated, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Emily collapsed onto the cot, her body limp, her breathing shallow and ragged. The air in the room instantly lightened, the oppressive weight lifting. The unnatural cold receded. Silence. A profound, ringing silence broken only by Emily's faint, gasping breaths and the frantic pounding of Alan's own heart. Father Michael rushed to Emily's side, his hands moving to check her pulse, his face a mixture of exhaustion and profound relief. "Emily? Can you hear me?" A faint moan. Then a whisper barely audible. "David." Alan felt a wave of dizzying relief, so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He stumbled forward, his legs weak, his entire body trembling. He reached the cot, looking at Emily's face. She was pale, drawn, and utterly exhausted, but the blackness was gone from her eyes. They were her own. Footsteps pounded outside the room. The door burst open, revealing Jessica and David, their faces etched with terror and desperate hope. They had been listening, waiting. "Emily!" David cried, rushing to her side, falling to his knees beside the cot. Jessica was right behind him, tears streaming down her face as she saw her sister awake, alive. Emily's eyes, though still unfocused, found David's. A weak, fragile smile touched her lips. "David, you're here." Alan leaned against the wall, utterly spent. His mind reeled. His scientific worldview had been shattered, rebuilt, and then shattered again in the span of a few hours. He had confronted something utterly beyond human comprehension, something that defied all logic and reason, and he had fought it with the very tools of logic and reason. He looked at Father Michael, who was now weeping openly, his head bowed in prayer. The priest met Alan's gaze, his eyes filled with a new deep respect. You saved her, Alan. You faced it. You truly faced it." Alan could only nod, unable to speak. His throat was still raw, his mind still reeling from the impossible void he had just navigated. He had faced the ultimate meaninglessness, and he had somehow found meaning within it. The tape recorder, forgotten in the chaos, continued to whir softly. It had captured everything. The screams, the whispers, the guttural roars, the final desperate shriek. And now the faint, trembling voices of reunion, of relief, of a fragile new beginning. Alan knew with chilling certainty that his life was irrevocably changed. The world was not what he thought it was. There were things beyond the veil of perception, entities that lurked in the spaces between thoughts, feeding on the very fabric of human existence. He had seen the void, and the void had seen him. And he knew too that while Emily was safe, while the entity was banished, it was not gone. Something that ancient, that fundamental, did not simply cease to be. It merely retreated. It waited. And the knowledge of its existence, the chilling understanding of its true nature, was a burden he would carry for the rest of his days. The tapes would serve as a testament, a terrifying reminder that some mysteries were better left undisturbed. But once disturbed, once seen, they could never truly be unseen. The darkness, he now understood, was always there, waiting. And sometimes it looked back.